The fuel depot at Rethon Station 16 didn't explode because of the humans. It exploded because Procurement Divisional Command had been filing the same corrosion compliance report for 11 years without sending an inspector. Because the station's automated sealant system had been cannibalizing its own reserve tanks since the funding was reallocated to the glorious Vanguard initiative, and because maintenance technician Euler had reported the pressure discrepancy 4 times in the last rotation, and been told each time that systemic parameters remain within operational tolerance. I know this because I signed the tolerance override. Twice. My name is Sefer Wraith. I was the 7th Border Logistics Coordinator for the Helvas Ascendancy's Territorial Frontier Division. That title sounds impressive until you understand what it meant in practice. I was the woman who kept 340,000 soldiers and 250,000 civilians fed, fueled, clothed, and breathing across 800 light-years of fortified border that the Ascendancy had spent 60 years calling impregnable. I knew it wasn't impregnable. I knew because I was the one holding it together with requisition workarounds and personal favors and a filing system that existed entirely in my head, because every time I submitted it formally, someone in Capital Logistics would optimize it, which meant stripping out the redundancies I'd built in because the official supply chain had 17 single points of failure that no one in the Senate cared about, because senators don't eat from frontier depots. The night the border fell, I was in my office running a comparison between our declared fuel reserves and our actual fuel reserves. The declared number was what the Senate saw. The actual number was what I used to keep the fleet's patrol routes calculated to a margin that wouldn't leave anyone stranded. The gap between those two numbers was 41%. 41%. Nearly half our stated capacity was fiction, propagated upward through a chain of reports where every level shaved a little truth off, because telling the real number meant telling your superior they'd been lying to their superior, and no one in the Ascendancy's military bureaucracy had survived a career by delivering bad news to people who had made their careers on good news. My console chimed at 2:14 local time, not an alarm. Alarms are designed to be heard. This was a network synchronization ping, the kind of background noise that means two systems are talking to each other. Except the two systems talking were Border Defense Grid 7 and Border Defense Grid 9. They shared a sensor overlap zone of about 4 light minutes. Under normal operations, they synchronized once every 30 seconds to avoid tracking the same object twice. This ping was a desynchronization alert. Grid 7 and Grid 9 had just tagged the same contact with different classifications, and neither was yielding. Grid 7 called it a mass transit signature, merchant convoy, flagged for customs. Grid 9 called it a military formation, unknown origin, flagged for interception. I pulled up the raw sensor data myself because that's what you do when you're the person who knows where the cracks are. I wasn't a tactical officer, I wasn't an intelligence analyst. I was the woman who moved food and fuel, and I was looking at this data because I had learned, over 23 years of service, that when two systems disagreed, the fault was almost never in the sensors. The fault was in whatever had been done to the systems between the sensors and the display. Both grids were reading the same thing, 1,100 vessels in a broad front formation, entering Ascendancy space from the neutral expanse at a velocity that our tracking algorithms weren't designed to parse. Grid 7's commercial filters had defaulted to merchant convoy because the energy profiles didn't match any known military signature in our database. Grid 9's military filters had flagged it because 1,100 ships in formation is a fleet no matter what your database says. I ran the velocity calculation by hand, then I ran it again. The formation was covering distance at a rate that would put it at our primary border stations in 11 hours. Our response mobilization time, the officially filed Senate-certified fully resourced response mobilization time, was 14 hours. The real mobilization time, the one I knew because I was the woman who actually had to move the fuel that made it happen, was closer to 20. I opened a priority channel to Frontier Command and said the words that, as far as I know, made me the first person in the Ascendancy to formally acknowledge the end of our civilization as a military power. This is 7th Border Logistics Priority Alert. We have an inbound formation of unknown origin, estimated 1,100 vessels, arrival at primary stations in 11 hours. Our actual response capacity is 20 hours at current reserve levels. We cannot intercept. Repeat. We cannot intercept. The response I received 14 minutes later was from an automated message filter telling me that priority alerts from logistics coordinators required command-grade authorization before distribution to strategic channels. I didn't have command-grade authorization. I was a logistics coordinator. I fed the machine. I didn't get to tell it where to go. So I did what I had done every other time the system failed to listen. I picked up the problem myself and started solving it from the inside. I need you to understand the border. Not the way the Senate understood it, a bright line on a strategic display representing the inviolable sovereignty of the Helvas Ascendancy, defended by 6 fleet groups and a network of automated weapons platforms that had cost more than the combined infrastructure of our 12 outermost provinces. I need you to understand it the way I did, from below. The Helvas Border Defense Network was built in 3 phases over 30 years. Phase 1 was the sensor grid passive and active arrays anchored to deep space buoys across the entire frontier. Phase 2 was the weapons architecture autonomous platforms, manned stations, and hardened fleet anchorages at calculated intervals. Phase 3 was supposed to be the integration layer, the command and logistics infrastructure that would allow the whole system to function as a single organism. Phase 3 was never completed, not officially canceled, never formally defunded. Simply deprioritized, then rescheduled, then partially allocated, then absorbed into other programs, then forgotten by everyone except the people who actually worked the border and had to invent workarounds for the gaps. The 30-year-old integration layer was me. Me and about 600 other logistics officers, supply coordinators, maintenance schedulers, and communications technicians who had collectively built an invisible system of informal protocols, personal relationships, and manual overrides that kept the border's 3 independent phases talking to each other. None of this was documented. It couldn't be. Documenting it would mean admitting the official system didn't work, which would mean someone had to explain why it didn't work, which would mean someone had to explain where the Phase 3 budget went, which would mean careers ending and Senate inquiries, and none of the people with the power to authorize documentation had any interest in that conversation. So the real border defense system was a ghost. It existed in our heads, in our private communication channels, in the favors we traded and the relationships we maintained. When Grid 7 needed a firmware patch that hadn't been funded, Technician Powell in Sector 12 would write one from personal reference files and distribute it through a maintenance channel that officially didn't exist. When Station 22's food stores were contaminated by a coolant leak, I would reroute a shipment from Station 19 by filing it as a training exercise provision transfer, because the forms for emergency resupply required authorization from a logistics command center that had been closed for budget reasons 9 years earlier. This is what the humans hit. Not a fortress. Not an impregnable wall. Not the shining shield of ascendancy sovereignty. They hit a 30-year-old patchwork held together by the unofficial labor of people who had never been promoted because the system they maintained couldn't officially exist. And it broke exactly the way I always knew it would. The first failure wasn't military, it was a routing table. At 0247, Grid 7's automated response protocol attempted to alert Fleet Group 3. The alert traveled through the communications backbone to Junction Relay Ometh, which forwarded it to Fleet Command's strategic distribution node. That node, per Phase 2's original architecture, was supposed to parse the alert, prioritize it, and route it simultaneously to all relevant fleet commanders with appropriate tactical context. The node had been offline for maintenance since the previous cycle. The maintenance was scheduled to take 4 hours. It had been scheduled every 11 days for the past 2 years because the node's processing cores were degraded, and no replacement had been requisitioned since the manufacturer was absorbed into a defense consortium that no longer produced the relevant components. During maintenance windows, alerts were supposed to be rerouted through the backup node at Vethra Station. Except Vethra Station's backup node was currently allocated to processing quartermaster reports for the Glorious Vanguard initiative because someone in Capital Logistics had decided that since the backup node was only intermittently utilized for its primary function, it could serve double duty. The alert died in a queue. I found it there 20 minutes later because I was already tracking the problem, and I knew from memory that the junction relay at Ometh forwarded to a node that wasn't operational on alternating cycles. I manually extracted the alert, reformatted it to bypass the strategic distribution system entirely, and sent it directly to every fleet commander I had personal contact information for, which was 4 of the 6. 2 of the 4 received it. 1 was asleep and had set his personal console to defer non-command authenticated messages. 1 received it, read it, and responded not to me, but to his tactical staff, ordering a readiness assessment that would take 6 hours to complete, because the assessment protocol required verifying fuel levels against the declared reserves, and the declared reserves were 41% fiction. By 03:30, 90 minutes after my initial alert, the Ascendancy's formal military response to an incoming fleet of 1,100 vessels was 1 readiness assessment in progress, 2 unread messages, 1 sleeping commander, and 2 fleet groups that hadn't been notified at all, and the formation was now 10 hours away. I began evacuation routing at 400, not because anyone ordered me to. No one with the authority to order an evacuation knew there was a reason to order one. I did it because I had run the numbers, and the numbers were the only thing in the Ascendancy that didn't lie. 340,000 military personnel across the border zone, 260,000 civilians in border settlements, stations, and mining installations, 600,000 people total, and the transport capacity to move in an emergency, pulling every available vessel including cargo haulers and passenger shuttles, about 190,000, less than a third. I sat with that number for about 45 seconds. Then I started building triage lists. I want to be clear about what triage means in this context. It doesn't mean choosing who lives. It means choosing who you can reach. The border stretched across 800 light years. Transport assets were distributed unevenly because population centers were distributed unevenly, because resource deposits were distributed unevenly, because geology doesn't organize itself around logistics officers' convenience. Some stations were close to each other and had good transport links. Some were isolated. Some had their own short-range shuttles. Some had been filing requests for shuttle replacement for years and were currently relying on scheduled freight runs that came once every 12 days. I mapped every asset I could confirm operational status for. Not the declared status said every shuttle bay was full and every fuel reserve was topped off. Actual status from my own records, from direct contacts, from the informal network that was the real border system. Fuel was the wall, not the humans. Fuel. We had enough fuel to move 190,000 people if we launched within 4 hours and didn't deviate from optimized routes. Every hour of delay reduced that number because the formation's approach compressed the safe corridor we could evacuate through. By hour 6, the number would drop to 120,000. By hour 8, to 70,000. By hour 10, the formation would be close enough that any transport in the border zone would be within engagement range, and the number would drop to 0. I started making calls at 04:15, not through official channels, through the network. Technician Powell, Station Commander Veshka at 22, who owed me for the food reroute. Communications Officer Dren at Junction Relay Ometh, who I'd trained 12 years ago and who still picked up when I called. Supply Coordinator Maleth at Fleet Group 2's Anchorage, who had been filing the same falsified fuel reports I had, and who understood immediately what the real numbers meant. One by one, I woke up the ghost system. Sephra, I can't authorize evacuation without... I'm not asking you to authorize anything, Veshka. I'm asking you to fuel your shuttles and move your civilian population to the interstations. Call it a drill. Call it whatever you want. But do it now. Because in 8 hours there's going to be something sitting where your station is, and I don't know what it's going to do when it gets there. How do you... Because I'm the one who knows what the fuel numbers actually are. And I'm telling you, we don't have time to go through channels. Channels are how we got here. Veshka fueled her shuttles. Dren manually rerouted my communications through a maintenance bypass so I could reach stations that were outside my normal distribution scope. Maleth began quietly redistributing fuel from Fleet Group 2's Anchorage to the civilian transport vessels docked there, filing it as pre-deployment calibration draws. Powell, that beautiful, stubborn technician, patched together a real-time tracker for every transport asset in the border zone and pushed it to my console through a channel that was technically decommissioned but still physically connected, because no one had ever bothered to pull the cable. By 500 hours, 3 hours before anyone in Frontier Command would formally acknowledge the incoming formation, I had 47,000 people moving toward the interior. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough, but it was what the Ghost system could do. At 6:20, Frontier Command finally authenticated the contact and issued a Priority 1 strategic alert. The alert went out through official channels. It reached all 6 Fleet Group commanders within 12 minutes, a response time that would later be cited in Senate hearings as evidence that the system worked. The hearings would not mention that 2 of those commanders had already been notified by me 4 hours earlier, or that the readiness assessment one of them had initiated based on my unofficial alert was the reason Fleet Group 4 was the only group that achieved partial mobilization before contact. The official alert triggered the official response protocol. The official response protocol required a synchronized fleet deployment from at least 3 fleet groups, coordinated through the Strategic Command Node at Yes Junction Relay OMETH, processed through the Yes currently offline Strategic Distribution Node, with fuel and logistics support provided by the Yes 41% Fictional Reserve System. I watched the protocol cascade. I watched it hit each failure point I had memorized over 23 years. I watched confident orders issued from warm offices deep in the interior collide with empty fuel tanks, unresponsive relays, cannibalized systems, and maintenance backlogs that stretched longer than some officers' careers. Fleet Group 1 attempted to undock from its anchorage at Tesserath Station. 3 of its 12 capital ships couldn't clear the moorings because the automated docking clamps had been serviced using components rated for a lower mass class as substitution, made 8 years ago when the correct components were backordered and never restocked. The clamps held. The ships didn't launch. Fleet Group 3 received its deployment order and immediately requested fuel allocation for deep space transit. The request went to the logistics hub at Sector Command, which processed it against declared reserves and approved it instantly. When the actual fuel transfer began, the automated pumping system at the hub's primary tank farm delivered 36% of the approved volume and then shut down because the tanks were 36% full. The declared reserve had been copied forward, report to report, for so long that no one in the chain between the tank farm and the Senate knew the real number. The tanks were not empty because of corruption. They were not empty because of incompetence. They were empty because every year for decades, a small amount of actual capacity was lost to minor inefficiencies, minor leaks, minor diversions, minor reallocations. And every year the reported number stayed the same because reporting the loss would require explaining the loss, and explaining the loss would require acknowledging the loss. And no one in a hierarchy built on the appearance of readiness had any incentive to acknowledge anything that made readiness look like less than it was supposed to be. The border didn't fall because the humans were strong. The border fell because we had been eating ourselves from the inside for 30 years, and the humans just happened to be the weight that found the crack. By 0900, the formation was 4 hours out. Fleet Group 4 was partially mobilized. 11 ships, the ones that happened to have full fuel and functional moorings. Fleet Groups 1 and 3 were still struggling. Fleet Groups 2, 5, and 6 were at various stages of attempting to execute a protocol that assumed resources which didn't exist. I had moved 83,000 civilians. My network was running on adrenaline and personal loyalty, and the communications bypass that Dren was maintaining by physically sitting next to a junction box with a manual override tool in each hand. At 0940, the first human communication was received. I didn't hear it in real time. I was deep in transport coordination, juggling shuttle schedules, fuel margins, and the increasingly frantic demands of station commanders who were discovering in real time that the systems they'd been reporting as operational were not operational. Dren forwarded it to me because she didn't know what else to do with it. It came in on a logistics coordination frequency, not a military hail, not a diplomatic channel, not a demand for surrender or a threat of annihilation. A logistics frequency, the kind used for supply chain coordination between allied forces during joint operations. The message was in Helvis Standard, grammatically awkward but intelligible. And it said, "Unidentified border stations, this is Terran Combined Fleet Logistics, Task Group 7. We are aware of large-scale civilian transport movements in your border zone. We are transmitting safe corridor coordinates compatible with your evacuation routing. These corridors will not be entered by any Terran military vessel for the next 14 hours. Acknowledge if received. No response required for corridors to remain open." Attached to the message was a data package. I opened it expecting a threat wrapped in courtesy coordinates for a kill box, maybe, or a corridor that would funnel our evacuees past their weapons platforms. It was an evacuation corridor map, not just coordinates, a full logistics package, corridor boundaries, velocity recommendations for the transport classes we were actually using. They'd been reading our traffic, timing windows coordinated with their own fleet's projected advance. And this is the part that made me set down my console and press my hands against my face. Fuel depot markers. They had tagged locations along the corridor where their own fleet tankers would be stationed, with an offer to provide emergency fuel to any Ascendancy civilian transport that needed it. They were offering to fuel our escape from their own invasion. I checked the corridor map against my own evacuation routes. They were nearly identical. Whoever built their logistics package was solving the same problem I was, with the same constraints, and they'd arrived at almost the same answer. The differences were small. They'd routed around 2 areas I hadn't flagged, and when I checked those areas, I found that they corresponded to the positions of our automated weapons platforms, the ones that were still functional. They were steering our civilians away from our own defenses so that our defenses could fire without risking our people. They were deconflicting their invasion around our evacuation. I stared at the data for 90 seconds. Then I forwarded the corridor coordinates to every transport in my network with a simple annotation. Use these routes, I've verified them. Malith called me within 3 minutes. Sephra, these are human coordinates. Yes. You're telling our transports to follow a route provided by the incoming hostile fleet. I'm telling our transports to follow the most survivable route available, which happens to have been calculated by someone on the other side who is better resourced than we are and who has no reason to kill civilians they could simply ignore. How do you know it's not a trap? I pulled up the map overlay. Because they marked our own defense platforms and routed around them, Malith. If they wanted our civilians dead, they'd route them toward the platforms and let our own guns do the work. Instead, they're protecting our people from our own automated systems. That's not a trap. That's someone who has a logistics officer as exhausted as I am. There was a long silence. How long have you been awake? Malith asked. Longer than you. Use the routes. He used the routes. By 1100, 2 things were happening simultaneously, and I was at the center of both. The first was the military collapse. Fleet Group 4's 11 ships had established a defensive line at the Veshon approach, the narrowest corridor into core border space. They were brave. They were competent. Commander Oleth, who led them, was a career officer I'd known for 15 years, a woman who had never once filed a falsified report and had been passed over for promotion 6 times because of it. Oleth engaged the leading edge of the human formation at 11:14. She lasted 9 minutes. I need to be precise about this because the Senate hearings later described the Battle of Veshon approach as a valiant but futile engagement against overwhelming force, which is technically accurate and morally bankrupt. The engagement was futile because Oleth had 11 ships, and the humans had 140 in the leading element alone. But the reason Oleth had 11 ships is that the other 61 ships assigned to Fleet Group 4 couldn't launch. And the reason they couldn't launch is that the fuel wasn't there, the parts weren't there, the systems weren't there, and the reports that said all of it was there had been accepted without question by every authority between Oleth's anchorage and the Senate floor. Oleth didn't die fighting the humans. She died fighting the gap between what the Ascendancy said it was and what it actually was. The humans disabled 9 of her 11 ships. 2 were destroyed, one from a reactor containment failure that, according to the post-engagement analysis, was caused by a maintenance deficit predating the battle by at least 3 years. The other took a direct hit to its engineering section, and I later learned the human vessel that fired the killing shot immediately broadcast a rescue beacon on the disabled ship's emergency frequency and held position for 11 minutes to make sure escape pods launched before moving on. Oleth survived. Her ship was disabled, atmosphere venting, power failing. A human destroyer pulled alongside, matched rotation, and extended a docking umbilical. They captured her by saving her life. The second thing happening was my evacuation. By 1100, I had 112,000 civilians in transit along the corridors, some using the human-provided routes, some on my original routes, some on improvised paths calculated by station commanders who'd received my initial warning and made their own decisions without waiting for authorization that would never come. The corridors held. Every single fuel depot the humans had marked was there, staffed, operational, and broadcasting assistance offers in Helva standard. And then the real collapse began. Not the military kind, the infrastructure kind. At 11:30, junction relay Ometh went down. Not from an attack, from cascading load failure. Dren had been running the manual bypass for 9 hours, and the junction's power systems maintained on the same deferred schedule as everything else. Finally exceeded thermal tolerance and shut down to prevent core damage. When Ometh went down, it took the communications backbone for the entire central border sector with it. 46 stations lost contact with each other simultaneously. My coordination network fragmented. Transports that were mid-route lost navigation updates. Station commanders who were mid-evacuation lost contact with the transports they'd just launched. Panic. I want to talk about panic because it's the thing that kills more people than weapons do. When a station commander loses communication with every authority above them, below them, and beside them, and there's an incoming fleet, and their fuel is at a level they've just discovered, doesn't match any number they were ever given, what they do in the next 60 seconds determines whether people live or die. Some of them locked down, sealed the stations, recalled any launch transports they could still reach, and prepared for siege. This was the trained response, the doctrinal response, the response that assumed the border defense system would hold and that sitting tight was safer than moving. The border defense system wasn't going to hold. Sitting tight meant sitting in the path of an advancing fleet with no communications and no knowledge of the safe corridors. Some of them kept moving, continued the evacuation on their last known good routes, trusting that the coordinates they'd received would remain valid even without real-time updates. This was the terrifying response. The response that required trusting a route provided by either me, a logistics coordinator with no command authority, or the invading fleet. I couldn't reach them. I couldn't tell the lockdown stations to reopen. I couldn't tell the moving transports they were on the right path. Ometh was down, and my ghost network ran through Ometh. Dren called me on a personal communicator. A handheld unit, consumer grade. The kind you buy for your children. Sephra, I can't get the junction back. The thermal regulators are gone. I need 6 hours and parts I don't have. What do you have? I have a working transmitter and about 4 hours of portable power. Can you broadcast? On one frequency, low power, maybe 30 light minutes of range. Put it on the human logistics frequency. Silence. Sephra, they're the only ones with a functioning communications network in this sector. Dren, broadcast our evacuation status on their frequency. Tell them which stations are locked down and which transports are moving. Ask them to relay. The silence lasted longer this time. I could hear Dren breathing. I could hear behind her the whine of a cooling system that was failing the same way everything else was failing. I trained under you, Dren said, 12 years ago. You told me the job was making sure the right information reaches the right place. You said the channel doesn't matter. The information matters. I remember. Okay. Dren broadcast our evacuation data on the Terran Combined Fleet's logistics coordination frequency, and the humans relayed it. Every station, every transport, every lockdown commander who'd gone silent. The humans picked up Dren's broadcast, integrated it into their own operational picture, and retransmitted it on every frequency we used: military, civilian, emergency, commercial. They transmitted our own logistics data back to us through their own communications network, filling the gap that our dead relay had created. Station 22 received the retransmission from a human destroyer that was simultaneously engaged in combat operations against the automated defense platform 4 light minutes away. The destroyer's communications officer split their bandwidth tactical data to the combat group on one channel, Hailvas evacuation routing on another. Veshka unlocked her station and resumed evacuation within 12 minutes of receiving the relay. At 1300, the formation reached the primary border stations. By then, I had 141,000 civilians in transit or arrived at interior safe points. The military situation was functionally over. Fleet Groups 1 and 3 had managed partial deployments that engaged and were defeated in detail across the border's length. Fleet Groups 2, 5, and 6 never fully mobilized. The automated defense platforms fired, accomplished nothing against ships that outmaneuvered the targeting parameters, and were systematically disabled. The Ascendancy's border, the bright line on the Senate's display, ceased to exist as a military reality at approximately 1340, less than 12 hours after my first alert. But I still had people moving, transports in corridors, civilians on stations that hadn't been reached yet. And now the human fleet was here, physically occupying the space my evacuees were moving through. The corridors held. I need to say that again because no one in the Senate hearings mentioned it, and no one in the official history recorded it. The safe corridors the humans had provided remained inviolate for the entire operation. Not a single Terran vessel entered a designated evacuation corridor. Not one. And then Sector Command, which had finally, belatedly, catastrophically woken up, sent me an order. Reroute all civilian transports to Vethra Station for military embarkation. All evacuees are to be consolidated for potential use as strategic leverage in ceasefire negotiations. I read the order twice. Strategic leverage. They wanted to put 250,000 civilians in one station and use their presence as a bargaining chip. They wanted to concentrate every person I'd spent 11 hours saving into a single location so that the negotiators could point at them and say, "You can't fire on Vethra. Our people are there." It was logical. From a strategic standpoint, it was probably even sound. A concentrated civilian population in a known location creates a constraint on an advancing military force that has demonstrated interest in minimizing civilian casualties. The humans clearly didn't want to kill our people, so putting our people where the humans would have to engage them would create a zone of de facto immunity. It was also the most dangerous thing I could imagine doing with 140,000 lives. Because it assumed the humans would continue to behave the way they'd been behaving, and it assumed nothing else would go wrong. And as I had just spent 11 hours demonstrating, everything in the Ascendancy's border system was built on assumptions about things that would definitely go wrong. One malfunction, one miscommunication, one automated system triggering on the wrong target at the wrong time, one panicking officer on either side making one wrong call, and 250,000 people concentrated at a single point become 250,000 casualties. The order had command-grade authorization. It came from someone with the rank and the standing to issue it. It was the official directive of the institution I'd served for 23 years. I looked at it for about 10 seconds, then I deleted it and continued routing my transports to dispersed interior positions along the corridors that the humans were holding open. I want to be precise about what I did, because the tribunal was very interested in precision. I did not refuse the order. Refusing the order would have required acknowledging it, which would have created a record, which would have triggered an override protocol that would have given Sector Command direct access to the transport coordination network I'd built, the Ghost Network, the one that actually worked. I deleted the order. I removed it from the queue, and I continued doing what I'd been doing, saving people using the system I'd spent my career building to compensate for the system that didn't work. Maleth saw what I'd done. He didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "The transport from Station 31 is running low. I'm redirecting them to the second human fuel point." We kept working. The border collapsed before dawn. That's what the histories say. It's a good line. Clean and dramatic. The kind of thing that fits on a memorial plaque or in the opening paragraph of a Senate inquiry report. Here's what actually happened before dawn. I moved 168,000 civilians out of the combat zone. The Ghost Network, Paul, Dren, Veshka, Maleth, and about 40 other people whose names have never appeared in any official record, operated for 14 continuous hours using improvised systems, personal equipment, and a communications backbone partially provided by the military force we were fleeing from. 12,000 people died, Station 14, which I couldn't reach because the communications failure hit before I could route a transport there. Mining installation Korath, which was too far from any corridor, and whose shuttle had been decommissioned 3 years ago on paper, but had actually been stripped for parts to fix the shuttle at Installation Hoven, because that was how the system worked. You cannibalized one thing to save another, and you never told anyone, because telling someone meant admitting the thing you cannibalized was broken. 4,000 military dead, most of them in ships that couldn't fight because they couldn't fuel, couldn't move because they couldn't undock, couldn't defend themselves because the systems that were supposed to protect them had been degraded by 1,000 small decisions made by 1,000 people who were each individually acting reasonably within a system that was collectively insane. Commander Oleth survived. She was taken aboard the human destroyer that docked with her crippled ship, and I later learned she spent 9 days as a prisoner of war, during which her captors treated a spinal compression injury she'd sustained in the engagement, using medical equipment that the Ascendancy's own field hospitals hadn't been supplied with in 4 years. Dren collapsed at hour 13 from dehydration and exhaustion. A human medical team found her at Junction Relay Ometh 2 days later, still sitting next to the junction box with the manual override tool in her hand. They treated her and left a case of nutrient rations, hydration packs, and a portable power cell compatible with our systems. They didn't take the relay. They didn't disable it. They left a note in Helva Standard that said, "Your relay's thermal regulators need replacing. We left compatible components in the storage bay. The specification file is on the power cell's data chip." They repaired our communications infrastructure, the infrastructure they'd just rendered irrelevant by conquering the border it served. I sat in my office at 0617 hours after the first ping. The border was gone. The formation of the human armada was distributed across our former frontier, in a pattern I recognized because I'd spent my career studying how forces occupy space. It was a logistics pattern. They were setting up supply lines not for an advance into our territory, but for a sustained presence along the border zone. They weren't pushing inward. They were holding the line they'd taken and building infrastructure. I watched their supply ships arrive. I watched them establish depot positions that mirrored almost exactly the depot positions I'd recommended in a proposal 7 years ago that Sector Command had rejected because it duplicated existing capacity. The capacity it duplicated didn't exist. The humans were building in days the system I'd spent 2 decades trying to get funded. At 0800, I received a communication on the logistics frequency, not a broadcast, a directed signal aimed at my office's console address. They'd pulled my identifier from the evacuation coordination traffic from the data I'd been routing through their network for the past 6 hours. 7th Border Logistics Coordinator Sephra Wraith. This is Terran Combined Fleet Logistics, Task Group 7. Senior Coordinator Chen Wei. I've been watching your evacuation routing. You did 14 hours on a system held together with improvised relays and personal contacts. I'd like to compare supply chain architectures when the situation permits. Your dispersal pattern was better than ours in 3 sectors. We'd like to understand why. No obligation. Open channel. Chen Wei. I read it 4 times. Not a demand, not a surrender condition, not a political communication. A logistics officer on the other side of a border that no longer existed, reaching out to a logistics officer on my side because they'd seen my work and wanted to compare notes. Professional recognition. From the person whose fleet had just dismantled everything I'd spent my life maintaining. I should have felt rage. I should have felt the patriotic fury that the Senate would later try to manufacture in every citizen, the righteous anger of violated sovereignty, the burning need to resist, to rebuild, to fight back. What I felt was tired, and something else that took me a long time to name. Relief. Not relief that we'd been conquered. Not relief that the border was gone. Relief that someone, somewhere, had looked at the actual problem, the real problem, the logistics of keeping people alive in a place where systems fail, and had not lied about it, had not filed a false report, had not declared the capacity sufficient when the capacity wasn't there, had not looked at a fuel gauge reading 36% and written down 100. Chen Wei's supply chain was visible, functional, real. Every depot they'd established corresponded to an actual capability. Every route they'd calculated used actual numbers. Their system worked because it was built on what was true instead of what was comfortable. And I realized that the border hadn't fallen because of the humans. The border had fallen because we'd spent 30 years lying to ourselves about what was holding it up, and the humans were simply the first real weight we'd placed on the structure since we'd stopped maintaining it. The tribunal convicted me of dereliction of command protocol and unauthorized disposal of a strategic directive. The sentence was 30 months in a military detention facility, suspended pending review. The review never came because the Ascendancy's military detention system was, you will be unsurprised to learn, operating at a fraction of its stated capacity and couldn't process the backlog of cases generated by the border collapse. I was released to administrative supervision and reassigned to a reconstruction logistics unit, one of the joint human Helvas teams established under the interim governance agreement. My title was Civilian Infrastructure Recovery Specialist. My job was the same thing it had always been, making sure things got to where they needed to be. The difference was that now, when I filed a supply status report, The number on the report had to match the number in the tank. I resisted this at first, not consciously, not with intention, but I caught myself in the first weeks, instinctively smoothing numbers, rounding up, projecting optimistic completion dates, building a small margin of fiction into every document because that was how I'd survived for 23 years. You always kept a little buffer between reality and the report, because reality was always worse, and the report was what people acted on, and if the report was too honest, people panicked and made bad decisions. Chen Wei caught it on the 4th day. She didn't reprimand me. She pulled up the report, showed me the discrepancy, and said, "If we lie about the supply numbers, we build the next version of the system that just fell down." She said it without judgment, without accusation, like she was describing weather. I stared at the report. 17 kilotons of construction materials listed as 18. A single kiloton of fiction, meaningless in isolation. But I had spent 23 years watching meaningless fiction accumulate, report by report, cycle by cycle, until the gap between the declared border and the actual border was wide enough to pour a civilization through. I corrected the report, and then I corrected the next one, and the next. And every time the number was ugly, every time actual capacity was less than projected, every time a timeline was longer than hoped, every time a system was more broken than expected, I wrote down what was true. It was the hardest thing I did in the reconstruction, harder than the 16-hour days, harder than working alongside the people whose fleet had dismantled my life's work, harder than looking at the new depot system they were building and seeing the ghost of the proposal I'd submitted 7 years ago that my own government had rejected. The hardest thing was writing true numbers in a system that would actually use them. 3 years later, I stood at the site of Junction Relay Ometh. The junction had been rebuilt. New thermal regulators, new processing cores, new power systems. A joint engineering team, Halvis and Human, had reconstructed it as part of the communications backbone for the new border monitoring network. There was no border anymore, not the kind the Ascendancy had built: the bright line, the sovereign wall, the impregnable fiction. The new network monitored traffic, weather, navigational hazards, and resource flows. It was a logistics system, not a weapons system. It was designed to help things get where they needed to go, rather than to prevent them from going there. Dren was the station commander. She'd been promoted the first time anyone in the Ghost Network had been formally recognized for the work we'd done. She showed me the new systems with a quiet pride that I recognized because I'd felt it myself, once, before the weight of maintaining a fiction had grounded into something more like endurance. "Do you know what Chen Wei told me?" Dren said. "She said the humans have a saying, the most expensive maintenance is the maintenance you skip." I looked at the junction. Solid, real, functional. Every component rated for its actual load, every system documented, every maintenance schedule funded and enforced. "We had that saying too," I said. "We just stopped believing it. I think about the border sometimes, not the new one, the old one, the one I held together with favors and workarounds and a filing system in my head. The bright line that the Senate projected onto their displays and congratulated themselves for defending while the actual defense was being performed by 600 invisible people whose names were never in any official record. I think about the 12,000 people at Station 14 and mining installation Korath, the ones I couldn't reach. The ones who died inside a system that had been telling itself it was ready for 60 years and discovered in 11 hours that it wasn't. I think about Malith, who saw me delete a command-authorized order and said nothing except to redirect a fuel-short transport to an enemy depot. I think about Oleth, whose spine was repaired by the people who broke her ship. I think about Dren sitting next to a junction box for 13 hours with consumer-grade equipment, broadcasting our logistics data on an enemy frequency because I told her the channel doesn't matter, the information matters. And I think about Chen Wei's message, the first communication I received from the other side. Not a demand, not a threat. A professional reaching out to a professional because she'd seen the shape of what I'd built in the evacuation routing and recognized it for what it was. She didn't know, when she sent that message, that she was looking at the ghost. The real border defense system, the one that never appeared in any report, never received any funding, never earned any recognition. The one that saved 168,000 lives while the official system was still trying to figure out why its fuel gauges read empty. The Ghost saved more people than the Fortress. That's the thing I need you to understand. The invisible, unfunded, undocumented system built by exhausted people working outside their authority on personal equipment through informal channels, that system outperformed the 60-year, multi-trillion credit border defense network that the Senate called the shield of civilization. Not because the people in the Ghost network were heroes. We were tired, we were scared, we cut corners and made mistakes, and I deleted a lawful order because following it would have killed people, and I can't prove that it would have killed people, because the scenario I was afraid of never happened, because I didn't follow the order. We outperformed the Fortress because we worked with what was true. The fuel was at 36%, so we planned for 36%. The relay was down, so we found another path. The corridors were provided by an adversary, so we verified them and used them because they were better than ours. The system failed, so we built a new one out of whatever we had in real time, with no authority and no budget and no certainty that any of it would work. That's not heroism, that's logistics. And logistics, honest logistics. Logistics built on true numbers and real capacity and the willingness to look at what's actually in the tank, instead of what the last report said is the difference between a border that holds and a border that collapses before dawn. The humans didn't teach me that. I already knew it. I'd known it for 23 years. They just built a system where knowing it was enough. I still have Chen Wei's first message saved on a personal data chip. I look at it sometimes late at night, when the weight of the 12,000 comes back and I need to remember that something survived. Your dispersal pattern was better than ours in 3 sectors. We'd like to understand why. She wanted to understand why. Not to exploit it, not to file it, and not to classify it and forget it. She wanted to understand why, because understanding why is how you make the next system better. And making the next system better is how you keep the next 12,000 alive. That's what I do now. That's all I've ever done. I make sure things get where they need to go, and I write down what's actually in the tank. The numbers are ugly sometimes. They're always true. That's the border that doesn't fall.